two cops humiliated and handcuffed a black man at O'Hare Airport, thinking he was just another suspect. Moments later, they froze in terror when he revealed he's the FBI director. You won't believe the shocking consequences that followed. He was stopped by two police officers. The reason? A vague report about a suspicious person. Their looks, their tone, everything about them was laced with judgment and prejudice. He tried to stay calm, respond with reason, asserting his civil rights, but his composure only seemed to fan the flames. The insults came quickly, targeting his skin color, his supposed inferiority. To them, any resistance, even the slightest, was intolerable. They saw only a defiant black man who, in their minds, needed to be taught a lesson. Then the worst happened. Amid the shouts and stunned gazes of onlookers, he was subdued with force. The cold snap of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed. A successful, respected man, now treated like a dangerous criminal in broad daylight. The two officers reveled in their actions, convinced they'd achieved a feat, taught this man a lesson. But they had no idea of the fatal mistake they'd just made. They were completely unaware of who this man truly was, the man they'd just insulted and cuffed. As the night in Chicago drew to a close, a United Airlines plane touched down gently on runway 28R at O'Hare International Airport. Elias Barnes exhaled softly, a subtle gesture unnoticed by those around him in the sparse first-class cabin, but one that carried immense relief after a nearly 4-hour flight from Washington, D.C. His unscheduled trip to a closed-door security conference in Europe had stretched longer than expected, and all he wanted now was to get home, to the rare tranquility he could find amid his hectic routine. He waited patiently until the seatbelt sign turned off and the plane pulled up to gate B12. At nearly 60, Elias Barnes retained the tall, lean frame of someone who'd spent much of his life in law enforcement and intelligence. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his face stern but his eyes sharp, calm, with a gaze that instinctively observed. Dressed in a well-tailored but understated suit and a slightly loosened dark blue tie, his presence exuded professionalism and authority without drawing attention, a skill honed over years of working in the shadows and the political spotlight. He carried only a black leather briefcase filled with classified documents and a small bag of personal items. No entourage, no visible Secret Service escort. How he often traveled for unofficial or highly confidential missions to avoid unnecessary attention in public. Airports, with their crowds and potential chaos, were always a high liquor environment, even for the head of the United States' most powerful investigative agency. When the plane doors opened, Barnes reluctantly joined the flow of disembarking passengers, pulling his small suitcase with the briefcase tucked securely under his arm. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings out of professional habit, faces, gestures, abandoned objects. It was an automatic reflex, a constant assessment for anything out of the ordinary. The waiting area of Terminal 1 was packed despite the late afternoon hour. Overhead speakers announced flights, suitcase wheels clattered on the floor, and voices of all kinds created the usual airport cacophony. Barnes kept a prudent distance from others, moving silently toward the connecting flights area for his next leg to Washington, D.C. He had no checked luggage, a habit that saved time and reduced risks. Meanwhile, not far from Gate B12, 2 Chicago Police Department officers patrolled the airport. Officer Gary Peterson, a white man in his 50s with a face etched by exhaustion and discontent, leaned against a pillar, staring blankly at passers-by. Beside him was Officer Ryan Hayes, younger, in his 30s, also white, with a bit more energy but lacking the confidence of experience. Peterson grumbled about endless shifts and how underpaid he was. He'd been on the job too long to not feel jaded and cynical. His racial and class biases were so ingrained that he'd turned security into an excuse to unleash his personal frustrations on those he deemed out of place or suspicious. Suddenly, his shoulder radio crackled briefly before falling silent. A message popped up on his handheld device, a report from an airport security agent about a suspicious individual near Gate B12. The details were maddeningly vague: a black man in dark clothing acting nervous, walking alone, no specific behavior, no clear indication of a crime, just a subjective impression based on superficial factors. Peterson skimmed the message, a malicious smirk creeping across his weathered face. His gaze slid over the crowd exiting Gate B12 and locked onto Elias Bands, the only black man in sight who vaguely matched the absurdly generic description. "Look, Ryan," Peterson said, nudging his younger partner. "Looks like we've got a potential customer just as described." His voice carried a hint of satisfaction. Hayes followed Peterson's gaze and saw Bands walking calmly. He hesitated. The man seemed entirely normal, even exuding a certain authority. But Peterson was the veteran, and Hayes was used to following orders, trusting his judgment, even when it was tinged with prejudice. "Yeah, he fits," Hayes said uncertainly, trying to sound like he'd noticed something suspicious too. Peterson needed no further encouragement. He pushed off the pillar, adjusted his cap, and strode toward Bands with Hayes in tow, adopting a posture that tried to project authority but already hinted at something more arrogance. They stopped him so abruptly that Bands nearly halted mid-step. "Sir, stop." Peterson's voice was sharp, devoid of respect. Elias Bands paused, turning to face the two officers. His expression showed no surprise or fear, only a faint glimmer of irritation deep in his eyes. He'd been through this before, though less frequently in recent years, since his status had changed. Still, he knew the feeling well, being watched, judged, simply because of his skin color. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was low, firm, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to handling tense situations without losing composure. But to Peterson, that calm was an act of defiance. He stepped closer, eyeing Bands from head to toe, standing closer than necessary, a calculated move to apply pressure. "We've got a report about a suspicious person matching your description in this area," Peterson said, his tone implying it was an indisputable fact. "Please show me your ID." Bands remained composed, but didn't comply without question. "What's the specific report, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but with a subtle edge. "May I know what I'm suspected of? My understanding is that reasonable suspicion is required to detain a citizen and demand their documents." He spoke with legal precision, not to boast, but to remind them of the boundaries of their authority. His exact words and controlled demeanor seemed to irritate Peterson further, who despised confidence, especially from black men he considered inferior. "Don't ask so many questions," Peterson snapped impatiently. "This is an airport. We have the right to check anyone. Just show your papers. Got something to hide?" His gaze turned hostile. Bands realized arguing legalities would only escalate things. He sighed discreetly, reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and handed Peterson his Virginia driver's license. He knew the out-of-state address would only fuel their suspicions. Peterson snatched the license, glanced at the details, and looked up with contempt. "Elias Bands? Huh? From Virginia," he muttered with a mocking smile. "What the hell are you doing in Chicago, dressed like you're headed to a White House meeting? Doesn't look like you're here for family or a vacation." His tone dripped with sarcasm and judgment. Officer Hayes, seeing his superior take charge, chimed in boldly, trying to prove he could spot a suspect too. "Or maybe he's on a mission, transporting contraband, chasing a target." The accusations were baseless, thrown out solely because of Band's skin color, attire, and the vague report. Anger began to simmer in Elias Band's chest. He'd dedicated his life to serving this country, upholding law and justice, and now he endured humiliation and baseless accusations from the very men who, in theory, should protect those principles. But decades of experience and discipline kept him steady. He knew losing control would only spring the trap they were setting. "I'm here for work," Bands replied, his voice cold but measured. "And I'll repeat," he said, controlled but firm. "My work or my attire is none of your concern. It certainly doesn't constitute a legitimate reason to detain me, interrogate me like this, or throw out insulting insinuations." Peterson let out a cruel, scornful laugh. "Work trip, huh? What kind of mysterious, sneaky business trip or some shady deal people like you get into?" The phrase "people like you" was spat with unmistakable venom, its racial undertone clear. This time Bands couldn't stay silent, his gaze locked onto Peterson with chilling intensity. "Officer," he said, his voice low but brimming with authority, "your words are not only wildly inappropriate, they're blatantly discriminatory. I demand you stop this attitude and language immediately. Your conduct has crossed the line into unacceptable." Being directly called out for discrimination by a black man was a slap to Peterson's fragile pride. He exploded, his face red with fury. "When did I discriminate?" he shouted, spewing insults and adopting a crude, utterly disrespectful tone. "You're the one in question here. Don't lecture me. Who do you think you are?" Ban stood firm, his gaze unwavering, not backing down from the officer's rage. "I'm a United States citizen, and I have the right to be free from harassment and abuse by law enforcement. I have no obligation to answer your irrelevant, personally offensive questions. If you don't have probable cause based on concrete evidence to arrest me, then please step aside and let me pass." With that, he shifted slightly, intending to move forward. To Peterson, this was the final straw, a direct challenge to his authority. "You dare walk away," he roared, "resisting an officer? You're definitely hiding something." He turned to Hayes, eyes blazing with aggression. "Stop him. He might be armed. Grab him." It was a blatant lie, said only to justify the violence about to unfold. Hayes hesitated for a split second, seeing the calm resolve in Ban's eyes, but he couldn't resist Peterson's commanding order. Swept up in the escalating tension and his own instincts, he obeyed, lunging toward Bans to grab his arm. Bans, with reflexes honed by years of facing danger, reacted instantly to defend himself. He didn't attack, he deftly turned, brushing Hayes' arm away with a sharp movement. "Don't touch me," he shouted, his voice betraying contained rage for the first time. That act of legitimate self-defense was immediately twisted by both officers as aggression. "See? He's resisting," Peterson yelled, throwing himself at Bans too. A brief but violent struggle erupted in the middle of the airport concourse. Passengers panicked, scattering quickly, some pulling out phones to record the chaos. Bans, despite his height and defensive training, knew fighting back would only worsen things and endanger others. He tried to maintain balance, protecting himself without attacking, all while loudly denouncing the unjustified violence. But the strength of the two younger, aggressive officers prevailed. They slammed him to the ground with force. The impact dazed him momentarily. His briefcase and bag fell, spilling personal items across the floor. Hayes seized the moment, yanking out metal handcuffs and roughly twisting Ban's arms behind his back. The cold steel snapped shut tightly around his wrists, sending a sharp pain followed by numbness through his arms. The physical pain paled compared to the humiliation and fury consuming him. He was being treated like a dangerous criminal in public, all for daring to stand up for his rights against injustice and prejudice. Peterson, panting, looked down at Bans with a twisted, triumphant smile. "See?" he sneered, voice dripping with mockery. "Told you. You're the stubborn, uppity type. Now you'll have to talk pretty at the station." He crouched, picked up Ban's driver's license, waved it tauntingly in his face and pocketed it. "Let's see if you keep that smart mouth there." Elias Bans clenched his teeth, stifling a groan of pain and frustration. He closed his eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and fought to regain control. This fight wasn't over, it was just beginning, in the worst way possible. The two officers hoisted him up by his armpits. His expensive suit was now disheveled, his jacket askew, one pant knee faintly stained from the fall. But when he opened his eyes, there was no fear or desperation in them, only a cold, deep resolve that unnerved anyone who met his gaze, even in his vulnerable state. Peterson, still furious and intoxicated by his display of power, leaned closer, his voice thick with malice, aiming to humiliate further. "Well, Bonds," he spat the name mockingly, "you like playing tough, huh? Talking about your rights to cops. And now what? Who do you think you are to stand up to us?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a venomous taunt, a final attempt to break the spirit of the man they'd subdued. Bonds, wrists aching from the tight cuffs, straightened as much as he could. He locked eyes with Peterson's furious glare, and his voice came out clear, eerily calm amid the growing murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "I am Elias Bans," he said simply, directly, without a hint of submission. Peterson smirked smugly. "Yeah, I know you're Bans. So what? That name means nothing here. You're just another troublemaker." Bans didn't respond to the taunt. His gaze remained fixed on Peterson, cold and unrelenting. Then he spoke again, slowly, each word deliberate and sharp, like an invisible hammer striking the tense air. "Director." A brief silence hung in the air. Peterson and Hayes stared, waiting. "Of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The final words landed with absolute certainty, without a trace of doubt. "FBI." Silence crashed over the small pocket of the airport. The usual bustle of O'Hare seemed to vanish, leaving only a ringing in the ears and the stunned gazes of officers Gary Peterson and Ryan Hayes. Peterson's smirk froze, then melted into a look of total disbelief. The furious red of his face drained to a ghostly white. His eyes widened, fixed on Bands as if he'd heard something impossible, as if the handcuffed man before him had transformed into someone else. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead and temples. His mouth opened to speak, but only incoherent fragments came out. You said what?" he finally stammered, his voice cracked, trembling. "The director of the FBI." He stumbled back a step, eyes bulging with terror. Officer Ryan Hayes, the younger of the two, reacted even worse. At those 3 words he froze, his face drained of color. The hands gripping Bands' cuffed arms fell limp by reflex. He looked at Bands, then at Peterson with a desperate, pleading expression, then down at the handcuffs, as if just realizing who they'd restrained and arrested. Absolute fear gripped his mind. "God, no," he whispered, voice shaking. "No, it can't be true." His legs buckled, knees trembling. The sudden shift in the officer's demeanor, from arrogant aggression to abject panic, was so stark that even the onlookers, though unaware of the full context, sensed something monumental had just happened. Murmurs fell silent, replaced by curious, shocked glances toward the trio. Phones kept recording, capturing this astonishingly dramatic moment. Peterson was the first to snap out of his stupor, driven by survival instinct, the fear of catastrophic consequences, losing his job, facing prosecution, going to jail, overrode all else. He rushed toward Bands, nearly dropping to his knees, his voice now pleading, urgent, desperate. "Sir, Mr. Director, oh God, please forgive us," he stammered, his face pale and sweaty. This is a terrible mistake, a horrible mistake. We really didn't know who you are." He spun toward Hayes, who stood frozen, and shouted in a trembling, panicked voice, "Hayes, you idiot! What are you standing there for? Uncuff him! Uncuff the director now, hurry! You want us both locked up?" Hayes jolted, as if shocked, fumbling for the keys on his belt. His hands shook so badly the keys slipped to the floor. He dropped to retrieve them, his face blank, scrambling for the right key. Precious seconds of tense silence passed before he finally slid the key into the lock. A sharp click sounded as the cuffs opened, freeing Elias Band's deeply marked wrists. Meanwhile, Peterson kept begging, his voice choked with tears and belated regret. "We're so sorry, Director. It's just, the report was so vague. We were just trying to do our job. Maybe we went a bit too far. Please forgive us. Please don't ruin our careers. We have families." Elias Band slowly stretched his hands, rubbing the sore marks on his wrists. He said nothing, offered no response to the desperate pleas, showed neither anger nor forgiveness. He simply stood there, silent, watching the 2 cowering men with a cold, piercing gaze of judgment. The FBI director's silence was 1,000 times more terrifying than any accusation or threat. It signaled a storm was coming. As the air thickened with Peterson and Hayes' panic and Elias Band's unnerving silence, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the dispersing crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant David Miller, the on-duty Chicago Police Department officer at O'Hare, strode quickly toward the group. A white man in his 40s with a serious, professional demeanor, he'd likely heard about the disturbance via radio or a passenger's quick call. Flanked by 2 other officers ready to assist, Miller's eyes scanned the scene and immediately grasped the unusual situation. Elias Bands, a black man in a suit with red wrists, facing his 2 subordinates, Peterson and Hayes, who were on the verge of collapse, pale, sweating, and stammering incoherent apologies. Miller didn't recognize Bands right away, but knew enough to sense his officers had made a catastrophic error. "Peterson, Hayes," he barked, "report the situation, now." Peterson and Hayes tried to stand at attention, but were visibly shaken and terrified. Peterson attempted an explanation, but his words were jumbled, contradictory, blaming faulty reports and misunderstandings. Miller wasn't easily fooled. He turned to Bands, who remained eerily calm. "Sir," Miller said respectfully, sensing an unusual aura about the man, "I'm Lieutenant Miller, in charge of this area. It seems an unfortunate incident has occurred. Could you tell me what happened?" Elias Bands spoke then, his voice still low and steady, showing no agitation or fear. "Lieutenant Miller," he began, "I am Elias Bands." He paused, letting the name settle. I was unjustly detained by your officers based on a baseless report. They interrogated me with insulting, discriminatory questions. When I demanded to know the reason and refused to answer inappropriate questions, they accused me of resisting arrest, used excessive force, and handcuffed me. Miller listened intently, his face growing graver. He recognized the name Elias Bands, though he hadn't yet made the full connection. Bands continued, his voice unwavering. Lieutenant Miller, I consider the actions of Officer Peterson and Officer Hayes a gross violation of my civil rights and the professional standards of your police department. He locked eyes with Miller. And to be clear, Lieutenant, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The final sentence hit Miller like a thunderbolt. He froze momentarily, staring at Bands, then at his two subordinates, now completely paralyzed with fear. He finally understood their terror. He'd heard of FBI Director Elias Bands but had never met him in person. What he faced now dwarfed any prior situation. His reaction was swift and professional. He turned to Peterson and Hayes, voice firm. You two, surrender your weapons, badges, and radios immediately. You're suspended indefinitely pending investigation. He gestured to the two officers with him. They'll escort you to the security office. Peterson and Hayes complied without protest, defeated, knowing their fate was all but sealed. After they were led away, Lieutenant Miller turned to Director Bands, his face solemn and sincere. Director Bands, he said, on behalf of the Chicago Police Department, I offer our deepest, most sincere apologies for the utterly unacceptable behavior of the officers under my command. This is an extremely serious and shameful situation. We commit to a transparent, rigorous internal investigation with the utmost seriousness. Bands nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, though his expression remained cold. Lieutenant, I appreciate your professionalism. I request that this incident be officially documented immediately, and most importantly, that all video and audio footage from the body cameras of Officers Peterson and Hayes be preserved in its entirety, unaltered. That will be the core of the evidence. Your request will be followed to the letter, Mr. Director, Miller replied. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation, even at the federal level. Soon after, news of the shocking incident reached the highest levels of the Chicago Police Department, the mayor's office, and of course the FBI and Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. A seismic ripple coursed through the law enforcement community. The investigation moved swiftly, conducted in close collaboration between CPD Internal Affairs, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and the FBI. Body camera footage became irrefutable evidence, showing the vague report, Peterson's offensive and racist remarks, Hayes' violence and complicity, and the moment both panicked upon learning Band's true identity. Their personnel records were also scrutinized. As feared, Peterson had a troubling history of complaints for brutality, abuse of power, and discriminatory language, often downplayed, dismissed, or ignored. Hayes, while less egregious, showed a lack of independent judgment and a tendency to follow orders, even clearly wrongful ones. The investigation went beyond the two officers, questioning systemic issues within the police department. Was there cover-up or tolerance of such behavior? The FBI director's case unintentionally became a powerful catalyst, exposing dark corners. The findings were conclusive. Gary Peterson and Ryan Hayes were fired from the Chicago Police Department for gross violations of ethical codes, abuse of authority, and racial discrimination. But the consequences didn't end there. Given the case's severity and overwhelming evidence, including videos and the FBI director's own testimony, the Department of Justice opted to prosecute them under federal law. They were charged with violating civil rights under color of law per Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code, and faced potential additional state charges in Illinois for assault and unlawful detention. The trial of Gary Peterson and Ryan Hayes drew massive media and public attention. It wasn't just about two rogue cops. It was a critical test of police accountability and the fight against systemic racism in the justice system. In the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, the atmosphere was tense. Peterson and Hayes, seated at the defense table, looked aged, defeated, their faces etched with worry. Gone was the arrogance from that day at Ohio. The prosecution, led by DOJ attorneys, presented an airtight case, arguing the defendants acted out of racial prejudice, abused their authority, and betrayed public trust. The full video was shown to the jury, every word and action of Peterson and Hayes laid bare. The audience reacted with shock and dismay. The trial's climax was Elias Band's testimony. Appearing in a pristine suit, he spoke with calm, without anger or vengeance. His precise, objective, dignified testimony carried immense weight. He spoke not just as a victim, but as a leader of the justice system, condemning those who tarnished their badge. The defense tried to downplay the charges, claiming it was a misunderstanding caused by job stress and erroneous reports. They argued their clients were remorseful and had no racist intent, but their words couldn't counter the damning evidence. After days of trial, the jury deliberated in silence. When they returned, their faces were expressionless. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. In the case of the defendant, Gary Peterson, for violation of civil rights under color of law, the jury finds him guilty. For third-degree assault, guilty. Each guilty landed like a hammer. Both former officers were found guilty on all major charges. Peterson bowed his head, trembling. Hayes closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Weeks later at the sentencing hearing, the federal judge emphasized the crime's severity, committed by those meant to protect society, not abuse their power. Racial discrimination, she said, staring at Peterson and Hayes, is a cancer that undermines public trust and must be eradicated. Your actions not only harm your victim, but also thousands of honest officers who risk their lives daily. She delivered the ruling. Gary Peterson and Ryan Hayes were sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. A strong sentence sending a clear message that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. Both broke down at the verdict, led away by marshals, beginning their path to justice for mistakes made in mere minutes at O'Hare. Elias Bands watched the sentencing in silence. When the ruling was announced, he nodded slightly, not in satisfaction but in acknowledgement that justice had finally been served. Sunset light filtered through the windows of his office in the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. Bands gazed quietly toward Pennsylvania Avenue. Months had passed since the trial, but the aftermath lingered. He felt no victory. He knew his case was resolved swiftly and effectively because of who he was. His position had been both shield and sword. But what if he'd just been an ordinary citizen? Would his words have been believed? Would the footage have been taken seriously? Would Peterson and Hayes have been fired and prosecuted? Likely not. The O'Hare incident was a bitter personal experience, but also a painful reminder of a larger reality. Racism and abuse of power remain deeply entrenched, even in the system he leads. His story is just the tip of the iceberg. Countless others, perhaps millions, face unjust suspicion, unequal treatment, and violence daily without a voice or protection. Bands sighed, stepped away from the window, and sat at his desk. The responsibility he bore was immense, not just leading the FBI, but setting an example, driving change from within, building an institution that truly upholds human rights and tolerates no discrimination. His case was over, but the fight had only begun. This story teaches us a profound lesson. Prejudice and unchecked power can blind us, leading to grave injustices that harm individuals and erode trust in our systems. It reminds us to confront biases in ourselves and others, to stand up for fairness, and to hold those in authority accountable. In our lives, this means treating everyone with respect, questioning unfair treatment, and advocating for equality, no matter someone's status or appearance. Small actions, like speaking out, listening, or educating ourselves, can ripple outward, fostering a more just society. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to support these important conversations. Drop a comment below. What lessons did you take away, and how can we work together for change? Let's keep the dialogue going.